The candles had not even finished burning when Julian Ashford said the words that would follow Elena Whitmore for the rest of her life. "You were never my choice." He said it quietly, almost politely, the way a man might mention the weather, but every servant standing along the wall of the great hall heard it. The housekeeper, Margaret Fenwick, froze with a tray in her hands. The steward, Gareth Holloway, looked down at the floor as if the marble had suddenly become interesting. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Elena stood in her wedding gown, the fabric still smelling faintly of lavender water, her hands folded in front of her the way her mother had taught her. She did not cry. She did not ask him why. She simply lowered her head, bent her knees in a curtsy so graceful that even the footmen would speak of it for weeks afterward, and turned. She did not look back. Her heels clicked against the stone floor, steady and unhurried, as she crossed the length of the hall that was now, by law and by contract, her home. Behind her she heard nothing. No apology, no hesitation, just silence, and somewhere in that silence, the small, cruel satisfaction of a man who believed he had won an argument he never should have started. She reached the staircase before her hands began to shake. By the time she reached her chamber door, her breath had turned ragged. But she waited. She waited until the door was closed, until the latch clicked, until she was finally, completely alone, before she let herself feel anything at all. Then, and only then, did Elena Whitmore allow herself one single tear. She wiped it away before it could fall past her chin. Tomorrow, she told herself, she would begin again. She had no idea how right she was. The morning after her wedding, Elena rose before the sun and dressed herself without ringing for a maid. She had learned, in one single night, that she could not afford to wait for kindness in this house. Kindness, if it came at all, would have to be earned, and she intended to begin earning it before breakfast. She walked the grounds alone that first morning, past the rose garden gone slightly wild at the edges, past the stables where a stable boy named Peter Langley touched his cap to her without quite meeting her eyes, past the orchard where the apples hung heavy and untouched, as though no one had thought to gather them in weeks. Everywhere she looked, she saw small signs of a house that had been left to manage itself for far too long, a house waiting for someone to notice it. By the time she returned to the manor for breakfast, she had already decided something important. She would not spend her marriage waiting in her chamber for her husband's attention. She would make herself indispensable to this house long before she ever asked to be loved within it. 3 days after the wedding, Elena had still not spoken more than a dozen words to her husband. The house at Ashford Manor was enormous, cold in every sense a house could be cold, and staffed by people who had clearly loved someone else long before Elena arrived. That someone else had a name: Rosalind Ashcombe. Elena heard it first from 2 maids gossiping near the linen closet, their voices dropping the moment they noticed her in the hallway. She heard it again from the stable boy, who mentioned, without any apparent malice, that Lady Rosalind used to ride out to the manor every Sunday before the engagement was broken. Broken, not ended. Broken, as if something had been shattered against someone's will. Elena did not ask questions. She had learned, in the short time she had been at Ashford Manor, that questions were currency here, and she did not yet have enough to spend. Instead, she watched. She listened. She noticed the way Julian's jaw tightened whenever Rosalind's name came up in conversation, the way his eyes drifted toward the eastern window that overlooked the road leading to Ashcombe Land. She noticed, too, the way the house itself seemed to be falling apart in places no one bothered to mention. A section of the east wing roof had been patched with tar instead of proper slate. The stables held fewer horses than the empty stalls suggested there should be. The tenant farms, when she rode past them on her rare trips into the village, looked thinner than they should, the fences leaning, the fields underplanted. Nobody had told her about any of this. Nobody had told her much of anything, in fact, except that she was now the Duchess of Ashford, a title that seemed to carry all the weight of a crown and none of the comfort. On the 4th day, Elena found the ledgers. She had gone looking for nothing more than writing paper, wandering into the estate office while Julian was away meeting with his solicitor in the village. The room smelled of dust and old ink. Along one wall stood a row of account books, their leather spines cracked with age, and on the desk sat a newer ledger, its pages still crisp, filled with numbers that made very little sense to her at first glance. She sat down, she began to read. By the time the light through the window had shifted from gold to gray, Alina understood three things clearly. First, that the Ashford estate was deeper in debt than anyone in the village could possibly guess from the size of the manor alone. Second, that several payments to creditors had been delayed, some by months, a fact hidden behind vague notations that any casual observer would have missed. And third, tucked into the back pages in handwriting that was not Julian's, were instructions. Careful, deliberate instructions, written by someone who had clearly known the estate's troubles long before Alina had ever heard the name Ashford. The handwriting belonged, she would later learn, to Julian's mother, dead now for nearly 2 years. The instructions spoke of debts, of tenants, of a marriage that needed to happen for reasons that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with survival. Alina closed the ledger slowly. She did not mention what she had found to anyone, not yet. Instead, she began, quietly and without asking permission from anyone, to learn everything she could about the running of an estate. She spoke with the tenants when she could, learning their names, their worries, the small details of their lives that no one in the manor seemed to think mattered. She spoke with Gareth Holloway, the steward, whose stiff politeness slowly began to soften as he realized this new duchess was not simply going to sit in her chamber and wait to be noticed. Margaret Fenwick, the housekeeper, remained cool toward her for the first 2 weeks. Then one afternoon, Alina helped her carry a heavy basket of linens up the servants' stairs without being asked, without complaint, and without mentioning it afterward. Margaret said nothing about it either. But the next morning there was fresh tea waiting in Alina's chamber before she had even rung for it, and something in the house shifted, ever so slightly, toward warmth. Rosalind Ashcombe visited twice in Alina's first month at the manor. Both times, she arrived under the polite excuse of an old family friendship. Both times she sat with Julian in the drawing room for over an hour, and both times, Alina made herself scarce without being told to. She was not afraid of Rosalind. She simply did not yet know what kind of fight this was, or whether it was even her fight to have. On the second visit, however, Alina passed the drawing room door on her way to the library and heard, through the gap left slightly open, Rosalind's voice, low and careful. "You didn't have to marry her, Julian. There were other ways." And Julian's reply, quieter still, "There weren't, not for the estate, not for the tenants." Alina stopped walking. She stood very still in the hallway, one hand resting lightly against the wall, and listened to a conversation that was, in its own way, more honest than anything her husband had said to her directly since the wedding night. She did not go into the library after all. She went instead to the estate office, sat down at the desk, and opened the newest ledger once more. If Julian had married her to save the estate, then Alina decided in that quiet room with the fatting afternoon light falling across the account books that she would learn to save it herself, not for his sake, not even, perhaps, for her own pride, though there was some of that too. She would learn it because the tenants deserved better than leaning fences and thin harvests, because Margaret deserved a house that did not feel like it was slowly crumbling around her, because somewhere in this cold arrangement of a marriage, Alina Whitmore intended to become someone who could not be so easily dismissed with a single cruel sentence at an altar. She began staying up late with the ledgers, teaching herself the language of debts and interests, of tenant leases and seasonal yields. She wrote letters, careful and measured, to men in the village whose names appeared again and again in the account books. She asked questions of Gareth Holloway that made him raise an eyebrow, and then, slowly, answer honestly. One afternoon, riding out toward the village with only a groom for company, Alina stopped at the edge of the eastern farmland to watch a group of children chasing a loose goat through a field. A young mother, her arms full of washing, called out apologies for the noise, clearly uncertain how to address a duchess she had never properly met. Alina dismounted, helped chase the goat back through a broken gate, and stayed to talk for nearly half an hour, learning the woman's name was Alice Turnbull, that her husband worked the eastern fields, that the fence behind their cottage had been broken since the winter storms, and no one from the manor had come to see about it since. It was a small thing, a broken fence, hardly worth the notice of a duchess, but Alina wrote it down that evening in a small notebook she had begun keeping for exactly such details, tucked between careful sketches of the estate's accounts. She did not yet have the money to repair every broken fence on the estate, but she intended, when the time came, to know exactly which ones needed mending first and for whom. Julian noticed none of it. He was too busy avoiding his own house, riding out most mornings before Alina woke and returning most evenings after she had already retired. When their paths did cross, in a hallway or at a rare shared meal, his politeness toward her was careful and distant, the courtesy of a man who felt guilty but was not yet ready to say so. Alina did not wait for his apology. She stopped expecting one. Instead, she waited for the right moment, the moment when the numbers in the ledgers would finally demand action, when the quiet crisis she had discovered in that dusty office would become impossible for anyone, even a grieving, prideful duke, to ignore. She did not have to wait long. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a rider who did not bother to dismount before handing it to Gareth Holloway at the gate. Alina watched from the window of the small parlor as the steward's face changed while he read it, the color draining from his cheeks in a way that made her set down her teacup and go to him directly. "What is it?" she asked, and for the first time since her arrival, Gareth did not hesitate to answer her honestly. "A creditor," he said, "Edmund Voss. He is calling in the estate's debt early, all of it within the month, or he takes the eastern farmland as payment." Alina felt something cold settle in her chest, but her voice remained steady. "How much is owed?" Gareth told her the number. It was worse than anything she had calculated from the ledgers alone, worse because it did not account for the smaller debts scattered across a dozen other names, debts that would come due the moment word spread that Ashford was in trouble. "Does the Duke know?" she asked. "He will," Gareth said grimly. "The letter is addressed to him. I was on my way to deliver it now." Alina thought quickly. "Give me an hour before you do." Gareth studied her for a long moment, the way a man studies someone he is not yet certain he can trust, and then, to her quiet relief, he nodded and handed her the letter instead. She read it twice in the privacy of the estate office, her mind working through the numbers she had spent weeks memorizing. The eastern farmland was not simply land. It was home to 11 tenant families, families whose names she now knew, whose children she had seen playing in the lanes on her rides through the village. If Edmund Voss took that land, those families would lose their livelihoods within a season. She could go to Julian. She could hand him the letter and let him carry the weight of it alone, the way he had clearly intended for her to carry the weight of being unwanted. It would have been the easier path, and no one would have blamed her for taking it. Instead, Alina sat down at the desk, pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward her, and began to write. Her first letter was to Edmund Voss himself, requesting a meeting in the village within 3 days, before Julian could even learn the full scope of what she intended to do. Her second letter was to a solicitor in the county town, a man named Charles Pemberton, whose name she had seen mentioned favorably in her late mother-in-law's handwritten notes at the back of the ledger. Her third letter was to her own family, not for money, for she knew there was little enough of that to spare, but for something else entirely. The name of a merchant house in the city that had once handled her father's modest trade dealings and might, if approached carefully, be willing to extend credit against the promise of a good harvest. By the time Julian returned that evening, dusty from a long ride and short-tempered from a conversation with a tenant about a fence he had no money to repair. Alina had already set 3 separate plans into motion, and she had done so without telling him a single word. She did not tell him for the simple reason that she was not yet certain he would let her help if she asked. And so, for the first time since her wedding night, Alina Whitmore made a choice entirely her own, without permission, without explanation, and without apology. Over the following days, she rode to the village more often than she ever had before, always with a reason that seemed small on the surface: a fitting for a gown, a visit to the church, a delivery of preserves to a sick tenant's family, and always, underneath that small reason, a quiet meeting that moved her plans forward one careful step at a time. Edmund Voss was a heavy-set man with sharp eyes and sharper instincts, and he was, at first, entirely unwilling to speak seriously with a duchess who had, as far as he knew, no authority over her husband's debts. Alina did not argue with him about authority. Instead, she laid out, calmly and precisely, the numbers she had memorized from the ledgers, numbers that proved the estate's harvest that season, if managed properly, would more than cover the debt within 18 months if given a longer term. Voss was not a cruel man, only a cautious one, and caution, Alina had learned, could be persuaded where cruelty could not. By the end of their second meeting, he had agreed in writing to extend the debt's deadline by a full year, provided the estate could show proof of a restructured repayment plan drawn up by a solicitor of good standing. The relief of that agreement lasted barely a week. On the very day Alina received Voss's signed extension, a second letter arrived, this one from a smaller creditor in the county town, a man named Frederick Camden who held a lesser debt against the manor's grain stores. Camden had heard, through the same village gossip that carried every piece of news across the county, that Ashford was in difficulty, and he had decided, with the instinct of a man who feared losing his money more than he cared about fairness, to call in his own debt before Voss could claim what remained of the estate's assets. Alina read Camden's letter twice, her stomach tightening at the thought of fighting the same battle twice in a single month. But she had learned something valuable from her dealings with Voss, and that was patience wrapped around firm numbers. She rode to the county town herself this time, without waiting for Gareth's counsel, and met with Camden in his own small office above a draper's shop. Camden was a nervous man, easily flattered and easily frightened, and Alina, though she disliked the necessity of it, allowed him to believe that the estate's arrangement with Voss made his own debt safer, not more precarious, since a stable estate paying one creditor honestly was far more likely to pay a second honestly as well. She offered him a smaller but immediate partial payment, drawn from the modest credit already arranged with the city merchant house, in exchange for a full year's patience on the remainder. Camden agreed, relieved to have any certainty at all, and Alina rode back to Ashford Manor as the sun set behind the hills, satisfied but exhausted, aware that she had just spent nearly every resource she had assembled to hold off 2 separate disasters within the same fortnight. That solicitor turned out to be Charles Pemberton, who arrived at the manor 2 days later at Alina's invitation, carrying with him not only his legal expertise but a quiet respect for the young duchess who had summoned him without her husband's knowledge and had, in the space of a single conversation, laid out a financial plan more coherent than anything he had seen from the estate in years. The merchant house in the city responded more slowly, but favorably, offering a modest line of credit against the promise of the coming harvest. Credit that would allow the estate to make its first payment to Voss without touching the tenant farms at all. Alina did all of this without telling Julian, not out of spite, and not, she told herself firmly, out of any desire to prove something to a man who had already made his opinion of her clear on their wedding night. She did it because the tenants could not wait for a prideful duke to swallow his grief long enough to accept help from anyone, least of all from the wife he had never wanted. It was Gareth Holloway who finally told him, 3 weeks after the letter from Voss had first arrived, when Julian summoned the steward to demand an explanation for why the creditor's threatening tone had suddenly, inexplicably, softened. "The Duchess arranged it," Gareth said simply. "The extension, the solicitor, the credit from the city merchants, all of it. She has been managing it for weeks." Julian said nothing for a long moment. Then he asked, in a voice that had lost some of its usual careful control, "Why did no one tell me?" "She asked us not to," Gareth admitted, "until it was settled." Julian found Alina that evening in the estate office, exactly where she had spent so many quiet hours over the past month, surrounded by ledgers and letters and the careful architecture of a rescue she had built entirely on her own. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before she noticed him, and when she finally looked up, her expression was calm, unreadable, nothing like the trembling bride he had dismissed at their wedding. "You saved the eastern farmland," he said. "It was not quite a question." "I saved 11 families," Alina corrected quietly. "The land was simply how they were tied to it." Julian crossed the room slowly and looked down at the ledger open before her, at the neat columns of numbers in her careful handwriting, numbers that told a story of debts managed and disaster narrowly avoided. For the first time since the wedding, he looked at his wife not as an obligation forced upon him by his father's will, but as a person entirely separate from the arrangement that had brought them together, a person who had, without asking his permission or his gratitude, done what he had been too proud and too grief-stricken to do himself. "I could have helped," he said finally, though even he seemed to hear how weak the words sounded. "You could have," Alina agreed. "You didn't." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been. Julian opened his mouth to speak again, perhaps to defend himself, perhaps to apologize, but Alina closed the ledger gently and rose from the desk before he could find the words. "The estate is safe for now," she said. "That is what matters." She left him standing alone in the office, surrounded by the evidence of everything she had built without him, and for the first time since he had spoken those cruel words at their wedding, Julian Ashford found himself entirely without a reply. It was 3 more days before Julian sought her out again, this time not in the estate office but in the small garden behind the eastern wing, where Alina had taken to walking in the early evenings when the house felt too large and too quiet around her. He found her standing near the old stone fountain, her shawl drawn tight against the cooling air, and he stopped a short distance away, as though uncertain whether he had any right to close that distance further. "I owe you an apology," he said, "not for the debt, for the wedding night." Alina did not turn immediately. When she did, her expression held none of the softness he had perhaps expected, none of the easy forgiveness that might have made this moment simpler for him. "You said I was never your choice," she replied, "in front of every servant in that hall, in front of people whose respect I would need to earn for years because of the 10 seconds it took you to speak those words." "I know," Julian said quietly. "You don't," Alina said, and there was no anger in her voice, only a plain, unflinching honesty that struck him harder than any raised voice could have. "You don't know what it cost me to curtsy and walk away instead of running. You don't know what it cost me to smile at Margaret the next morning as though nothing had happened, to ride into the village and pretend I was not the wife nobody wanted." Julian's jaw tightened, not with anger but with something closer to shame. "I was grieving," he said. "My mother's death, the debts she left behind, an engagement I couldn't keep because my family's survival depended on a marriage of convenience instead. I took that grief out on you, and it wasn't fair." "No," Alina agreed simply, "it wasn't." Julian took a step closer, and for a moment Alina thought he might reach for her hand, though he stopped himself before the gesture could be completed. "My mother wrote to me before she died," he said instead. "She told me the estate could not survive another year without a marriage that brought stability, land, or connections we did not otherwise have. Your family's name carried respect in the county even without great wealth attached to it. I told myself that was reason enough to go through with the contract." I did not tell myself how it might feel to be the woman receiving that reasoning instead of giving it. You still haven't, Alina said quietly. Told me, I mean, not directly. I found it myself in her handwriting at the back of a ledger you never thought to show me. Julian's expression flickered with something like shame. I did not think you would want to hear it from my mouth. I would have preferred it, Alina said, to hearing it from an old woman's handwriting in a dusty office, alone, 3 weeks into a marriage I did not choose either. She did not offer him comfort. She did not tell him it was understandable, or that she forgave him easily, because she did not yet, and she had decided, somewhere in those long nights bent over the ledgers, that she would not pretend otherwise simply to make him feel better about what he had done. It was into this fragile, unresolved silence that Rosalind Ashcombe arrived the following afternoon, her carriage pulling up the drive with the easy confidence of someone who had visited this house 100 times before and expected to be welcomed just as easily now. She found Julian in the drawing room and wasted no time on pleasantries. The estate is stable now, she said, without preamble. Voss has been managed, the tenants are secure, the debt is under control. Whatever reason there was for this marriage, Julian, it no longer exists. Julian said nothing for a long moment, and in that silence, Alina, who had entered the room only a step behind Rosalind without either of them noticing, felt the full weight of what was being decided in front of her. The reason for the marriage was never only the debt, Julian said finally, though his voice carried none of its usual certainty. Wasn't it? Rosalind pressed. Your mother's instructions, the estate's survival, a convenient bride chosen for practical reasons. None of that requires you to stay married to her now that the crisis has passed. It was Alina who spoke next, her voice calm and clear enough to make both of them turn toward her. I am not a debt to be settled, she said. Whatever reason brought me to this house, I am the one who kept it standing while the two of you were still deciding whether I mattered enough to be told the truth. Rosalind's expression flickered, something between surprise and reluctant respect, but it was Julian's face that held Alina's attention, the way his eyes moved from Rosalind to his wife and back again, as though seeing, for the first time, the shape of a choice he could no longer avoid making. I need time, he said finally, to both of them, and neither woman found the answer particularly satisfying. Rosalind left within the hour, her carriage disappearing down the same drive it had arrived on, and Julian retreated to his study without another word to Alina, leaving her standing once more in a house that felt, despite everything she had built within it, still uncertain of where she truly belonged. She did not chase after him for an answer. She had learned over the past weeks that some things could not be rushed, and that the estate she had saved with careful patience deserved no less patience in the matter of her own heart. That night, Alina returned to the ledgers one final time, not out of necessity, for the crisis had passed and the numbers were, for now, steady, but out of habit, and perhaps because the quiet order of columns and sums had become, in this strange house, the closest thing she had to comfort. She did not know what Julian would decide. She only knew that whatever choice he made, she would not curtsy and walk away a second time without first knowing exactly where she stood. It took Julian 4 days to find the courage for what he needed to say, 4 days in which Alina continued the quiet, steady work of running an estate that was no longer simply surviving, but beginning, slowly, to thrive. The tenant farms saw their first proper repairs in years, funded by the careful credit she had arranged. Margaret Fenwick, the housekeeper, had begun speaking to her not with polite distance but with genuine warmth, even confiding, over a shared pot of tea one afternoon, that the house had not felt this alive since the old Duchess had passed. On the 5th morning, Julian summoned the entire household staff into the great hall, the same hall where he had once spoken his cruelest words in front of all of them. Alina, called to join them without explanation, felt her stomach tighten as she walked down the same staircase, She had once descended in tears she refused to let fall. Julian stood near the same spot where he had once dismissed her, and this time when he spoke, his voice carried none of the cold detachment of their wedding night. 3 months ago, he said, addressing the staff but looking directly at Alina, I said something in this hall that I have regretted every day since. I told my wife she was never my choice, and I said it in front of all of you because I was too consumed by my own grief to consider what it would cost her. The hall was silent, every servant watching, just as they had watched 3 months before. I was wrong, Julian continued. Not simply about the cruelty of those words, but about their truth. Alina has done more for this estate, for every family who depends on it, than I managed in the 2 years since my mother's death. She did it without asking for my gratitude, and she has earned far more than an apology from me. He crossed the hall then, and from beneath his coat he produced a folded document, its seal already broken, and held it out to Alina. This is the deed of trust for the Ashford estate, he said, rewritten, as of this morning, in both our names, not because the law requires it, because it is true. This estate stands today because of you, and it will continue standing only because of both of us together. Alina took the document slowly, her fingers steady despite the sudden unsteadiness of her breath. She did not throw herself into his arms, and she did not weep with relief in front of the assembled staff. She had learned, over these past months, that trust was not something restored with a single gesture, however grand, and she intended to let this one prove itself over time before she gave her heart to it fully. "Thank you," she said simply, and the words carried more weight in the hall than any longer speech could have managed. Rosalind Ashcombe learned of the decision by letter, sent to her personally by Julian before the household announcement, a courtesy he felt she deserved after years of genuine friendship between their families, whatever complications had grown from it. She did not come to the manor again after that. Word reached Ashford some months later that she had accepted a courtship from a gentleman in the county town, a man who, by all accounts, chose her freely and completely, without the shadow of any other obligation standing between them. Alina hoped, sincerely, that Rosalind found in that new courtship the wholehearted choice she herself had once been denied. In the months that followed, Ashford Manor became, slowly and steadily, a different kind of house. The tenant farms flourished under careful management. The east wing roof was finally repaired with proper slate instead of tar. Margaret Fenwick took to humming quietly while she worked, a habit the older staff swore they had not heard from her since the old Duchess had been alive. Gareth Holloway, who had once studied Alina with cautious uncertainty, now consulted her directly on estate matters as a matter of course, trusting her judgment as thoroughly as he trusted Julian's. Alice Turnbull's broken fence was repaired before the first frost, along with a dozen others Alina had quietly listed in her small notebook over the preceding months. Peter Langley, the stable boy who had once been too shy to meet her eyes, was given a proper apprenticeship with the estate's head groom, a decision Alina made after noticing how carefully the boy handled even the most difficult horses. Frederick Camden's debt was paid in full within 10 months, well ahead of the year he had reluctantly agreed to, and Edmund Voss himself sent a short note of respect when the final payment against his own debt arrived early as well, remarking that he had rarely seen an estate recover so completely, or so honestly. Julian did not expect, and did not receive, an easy or immediate forgiveness for the cruelty of that first night. Instead, he earned Alina's trust the way she had earned the estate's survival, one deliberate, consistent choice at a time. He rode with her through the tenant farms instead of avoiding them. He asked her opinion before making decisions instead of assuming his own judgment was sufficient. He learned, slowly, to see his wife not as an arrangement forced upon him by his mother's dying instructions, but as a partner he had been fortunate enough, despite his own foolishness, to have chosen after all, even if it had taken him far too long to realize it. Nearly a year after her wedding day, Alina found herself once more standing at the top of the great hall staircase, the same staircase she had descended in silent grief on the night Julian had first spoken those cruel words. This time, she paused at the top, looking down at the hall below, now warmly lit. The walls hung with new tapestries she had chosen herself, the household staff moving through it with an ease and comfort that had not existed when she first arrived. Julian stood at the bottom of the staircase, waiting for her, just as he had on their wedding night, though everything else about the moment had changed entirely. Alina descended the stairs slowly, her steps steady and sure, and when she reached the bottom she did not curtsy this time. She simply took his offered hand, and together they walked into the hall as equals, as partners, as two people who had built, out of the wreckage of a cruel beginning, something far stronger and far more honest than either of them could have imagined on that first, painful night. She did not look back at the staircase behind her. She did not need to. Whatever had happened on those steps a year before belonged, at last, entirely to the past, and Alina Whitmore, now truly the Duchess of Ashford in every sense that mattered, walked forward into a future she had chosen for herself, one deliberate, unhurried step at a time. Comment for next part.